The rose garden at Vale House was exactly 40 yards long and bordered on three sides by a stone wall that the ivy had been carefully trained to respect. Jonathan had counted the yards that morning, walking the perimeter before the tour guests arrived, because counting things steadied her hands when the rest of her was uncertain. The fourth side of the garden opened onto a sloping lawn that ran down to a ha-ha wall, and beyond that, the Vale parkland extended in every direction, green and unhurried, belonging entirely to itself. She was standing at the centre of the garden near the oldest of the heritage rose bushes when she heard Owen say the name. He said it the way a man says something he has said 10,000 times and expects to say 10,000 more, without ceremony and without particular volume, addressing the figure standing 10 feet from Jonathan with a set of pruning shears in one hand and a length of irrigation tubing in the other. He said, "Mr. Chambers will be joining us for the afternoon walk, Mr. Vale, if that suits you." The man with the pruning shears said it suited him fine, and the room rearranged itself. The garden rearranged itself. Every person within earshot turned, including Diane Vale, who was standing near the south wall with a glass of mineral water, and a face that had been designed over the course of a long life to express the precise gradation between polite displeasure and open contempt. The face went through 3 different expressions in the space of 2 seconds, which was 3 more expressions than Jonathan had seen it produce in 2 full days. Jonathan stood at the centre of the rose garden and did not move, because there was nowhere to move, and because she had learned a long time ago that stillness was not the same as surrender. She had applied for the volunteer position 5 months earlier, in February, when the charity's spring newsletter arrived in her letterbox by accident, the result of a clerical error that put her address on the mailing list for donors 2 tiers above what she was. She had not donated. She had read the newsletter at her kitchen table in the particular quality of February morning light that made everything look simultaneously very clear and very far away. And she had read about the garden tour at Vale House and about the Heritage Rose Collection, and something had turned over in her chest the way a page turns. She had applied to volunteer not because she expected to be useful in any meaningful sense, and not because she was trying to position herself anywhere socially. She had applied because she loved roses the way some people love languages, with a technical fluency that was also, underneath the technical layer, something more personal and less articulable. Her supervisor at the County Horticultural Service had written her a letter of recommendation in 3 sentences, which she considered appropriate. She brought her own gloves. The drive to Vale House on the first morning of the tour took 40 minutes, which she spent going through the botanical names of the collection's known cultivars in her head. The estate's newsletter had listed them by the old names, which she appreciated. Most institutions updated their signage to the common names and lost something in the process, a certain precision, a thread back to the people who had first looked at a particular rose and decided it deserved a name that would outlast them. Petra rode with her for the first 20 minutes, until Jonathan dropped her at the train station. "You're going to spend 2 days talking to plants," Petra said, pulling her bag from the back seat. "I'm going to spend 2 days talking to people," Jonathan said. "I will also talk to plants." Petra looked at her with the particular expression she had been perfecting since she was 12, the one that combined deep affection with genuine bewilderment, and kissed her on the cheek and said, "Text me if it turns out you need rescuing." Jonathan did not text her. Not that morning. Vale House stood at the end of a gravel drive that curved twice before it revealed the house, which was the kind of architecture that didn't announce itself because it had never needed to. 4 generations of the Vale family had occupied the house, which meant 4 generations of maintenance decisions, some of them good, none of them quite wrong enough to require apology. The stone was the colour of old honey in morning light. The windows were tall and the sills were recently repainted. The drive was bordered on both sides by pleached lime trees, their branches interlocked overhead in a tunnel that was either calculated or organic, and Jonathan could not tell which, and liked that she couldn't tell. She found the volunteer staging area in a courtyard behind the east wing, where a woman in a yellow lanyard was ticking names off a clipboard. Her name was ticked. She was given a green lanyard and a printed schedule and a brief instruction about where the volunteers were and weren't expected to stand during the guided portions of the tour. The woman with the clipboard was still talking when Diane Vale appeared in the courtyard doorway. She was a woman who understood the physics of a room, specifically how to alter them by entering one. She wore pale grey that morning, a particular shade that managed to look both casual and unmistakably expensive. And she stood in the doorway for a moment before she moved, long enough for everyone in the courtyard to have noticed her. Jonathan noticed her the way she noticed most things, steadily and without hurry, taking in the set of the shoulders, the particular quality of the gaze, the way her attention moved across the volunteers in the courtyard, not with interest, but with assessment. It lingered on Jonathan for a beat longer than it lingered on anyone else, and Jonathan felt the assessment land and understood what it was and did not adjust. Diane said something brief and pleasant to the woman with the clipboard, and then she said, addressing the group, that she hoped everyone would make the most of the 2 days, that the gardens collection was exceptional and deserved exceptional stewardship, and that she trusted the volunteers, understood the difference between looking and touching, and said it with a smile that never dropped. Jonathan wrote nothing in the margin of her printed schedule. There was nothing to write. She understood the communication perfectly. The morning tour began at 9:30 with the formal parterre garden to the north of the house, where the volunteers were positioned at intervals to answer questions from the tour guests about the planting design. Jonathan's position was at the far end, near a sundial that was older than the rest of the garden by at least a century, according to the plaque, and she spent 2 hours answering questions about the box, hedging, and the seasonal annuals, and once, a fairly detailed question from a woman in her 60s about the drainage requirements of lavender, which Jonathan answered fully and without condescension, which the woman seemed to appreciate. Diane passed the sundial position twice. The second time, she stopped. "The lavender explanation," she said to Jonathan in a tone that indicated she had heard some portion of it, "was a bit technical for a garden tour. Our guests are here to enjoy the space, not to sit an examination." The woman in her 60s, who was standing 3 feet away, said nothing. Jonathan said, "I'll keep that in mind." She paused, then said, "She asked a technical question." Diane held her gaze for a moment and then moved on. It was the kind of correction that was designed to establish something, and Jonathan understood what it had established. She was standing in a place that Diane considered hers, and Diane was making sure she understood the terms of her presence. Jonathan did not adjust her posture. She thought about the lavender and the drainage and was glad she had told the woman the truth. The rose garden was the afternoon assignment. She was given a briefing sheet that afternoon, a single page describing the collection's history and the 12 heritage cultivars that were the tour's centerpiece. She had not needed the briefing sheet, but she read it carefully anyway, because that was what you did with something someone had prepared for you. The collection was 4 generations old, meaning the Vale family had been tending these specific rose bushes since before anyone currently living at the estate had been born, which meant the plants had outlasted the people who had chosen them and were going to outlast the people who were maintaining them now, which Jonathan found both sobering and pleasant in roughly equal measure. She was walking the garden's perimeter, counting the yards and identifying the cultivars by their leaf structure before she checked their labels, when she heard the soft hiss of an irrigation line under pressure, and then, a moment later, the absence of that pressure. And then, around the corner of the west-facing stone wall, the sound of someone swearing quietly. She followed the sound around the corner. The man was crouching at the base of the wall near a junction box, with water soaking the knee of his trousers and a length of irrigation tubing in one hand. He was wearing work clothes, dark trousers, a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a canvas jacket that had been involved in a number of outdoor tasks, and showed it. He looked up when she came around the wall. "The fitting's split," he said. He held it up briefly so she could see. The crack ran along the side of the plastic coupling, a clean fracture, probably from the frost earlier in the season. "Have you got a spare fitting?" she asked. "In the shed, 15 minutes. She looked at the spread of water near the base of the nearest heritage rosebush, which was a Portland rose, she was fairly sure, one of the older varieties, and its root zone was already beginning to pool. "I'll hold the line shut while you go," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That'll be wet." "I have gloves," she said. She put her gloves on and crouched beside the junction box and pinched the split tubing closed while he went to the shed. He was back in 11 minutes, not 15. Together they fitted the new coupling and cleared the pooled water from the root zone with a small trench she scraped out with the trowel he had in his jacket pocket, redirecting it along the natural slope of the bed away from the base of the rose. When they were done, he sat back on his heels and looked at the restored line, and then at her. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question and it wasn't a compliment exactly. It was the specific observation of someone who has been watching a person work and has reached a factual conclusion. "I work in horticulture," she said. "County service." He nodded. He said his name was Marcus, and he worked the grounds. She told him her name was Jonathan, which was her name, and she was used to people pausing at it. And he didn't pause, which she registered without deciding what it meant. She went back to the perimeter walk. She kept her gloves on because they were wet anyway, and she had not finished checking the east-facing beds. She didn't see him again until the next morning. The incident with the irrigation line was not something she reported to the woman with the clipboard or mentioned to anyone else. It had been a practical situation that required a practical response, and she had given one, and that was the whole of it. She thought about the Portland rose and its root zone, and whether the pooling had been happening long enough to affect the crown, and concluded it probably hadn't. Diane's second correction came at 3 in the afternoon, during the formal guest walkthrough of the rose garden. Jonathan was positioned near the south end of the collection, next to a moss rose that had been trained up a section of the wall with a care and patience that someone had invested over at least a decade. And she had been there for 20 minutes when Diane brought the main party of guests around the corner and stopped at the centre bed to make her remarks about the collection. There were 11 guests in the afternoon party, and they were the kind of guests who attended charity garden tours at estates like this one, which is to say, they had the bearing of people for whom the phrase country house did not require further elaboration. They wore expensive casual clothing and asked considered questions, and stood at a comfortable social distance from one another that was also, Jonathan noted, a comfortable social distance from her. Diane was explaining the Portland collection's provenance, the cultivars acquired by Marcus's great-great-grandmother, she said, on a visit to France in the 1890s, brought back as rooted cuttings in damp cloth, which was the most interesting botanical fact in the entire briefing sheet, and Jonathan was listening because it was interesting when Diane stopped mid-sentence and looked at her. "The volunteer positions," Diane said, pleasantly and clearly to the assembled guests as much as to Jonathan, "are at the garden's entry and at the east border, not at the centre bed." Jonathan was standing at the south end of the garden, which was neither the entry nor the east border, but she understood the instructions' real content, which was not about geography. She said, "Of course," and walked to the east border, and stood there for the remainder of the walkthrough, and answered 3 questions from guests who came to look at the east border plantings, and was scrupulously accurate about everything she told them. Petra texted at 4 o'clock to ask how the plants were treating her. Jonathan typed back, "Fine." She put her phone in her pocket. The overheard sentence arrived at 4:30 through the gap in the stone wall where the old garden door had once been, and where the door frame had been removed, but the gap itself remained, covered now by a frame of climbing rose and nothing else. Jonathan was on the far side of the wall, in the service path that ran behind the west border, checking whether the new fitting had held through the afternoon's irrigation cycle, when she heard Diane's voice on the other side of the stone. Diane was talking to someone Jonathan could not see, another woman from the cadence of the response, and she was speaking at the volume of a person who was accustomed to her surroundings and did not require privacy. She said, "The estate has always attracted a certain type during these tours. Women who've read something in a newsletter and imagine themselves belonging here for a weekend." The other voice said something short and agreeable. Diane said, "I'm very careful about who I allow to spend real time in the rose garden. It took 4 generations to build that collection, and I won't have it managed by people who don't understand what this place is." Jonathan stood in the service path and did not move. The irrigation fitting was holding. She could hear it in the pressure of the line and in the absence of any running water at the base of the wall. She waited until Diane's voice had moved further into the garden, until she could hear it addressing someone else, before she straightened and walked back to the east border through the service path's longer route, around the north wall, which took an extra 4 minutes, but which meant she would not need to come back through the gap in the wall that afternoon. She thought about what Diane had said. Not the way you think about something that wounds you, but the way you think about a piece of information that has clarified something you already half knew. She had understood her standing in this place from the moment Diane had paused on her assessment in the courtyard that morning. The sentence through the wall had only confirmed it, and confirmation, whatever else it was not nothing. It had the virtue of certainty. She also thought about the Heritage Rose Collection and what it meant to have built something across 4 generations, and what it meant to consider yourself its custodian, and how a certain kind of custodian confused guarding with understanding. She did not contact Petra. The second day of the tour began with an overcast sky that held through the morning and broke into thin late spring sunshine around 11 o'clock. Jonathan arrived with her gloves already in her pocket and her own small sécateur in her kit bag, which she had brought the first day as well, though she hadn't needed it. She signed in with the woman with the clipboard and collected her green lanyard and was assigned the rose garden for the full day, which meant someone on the coordination team had noted her knowledge base and placed her accordingly, or it was coincidence. Either way, she was in the rose garden by 8:30 before the tour guests arrived, walking the beds in the low morning light. Marcus was already there. He was at the northwest corner of the garden, crouching at the base of the wall near the oldest section of the Portland collection, and she saw from the way he was positioned that something was wrong with the plants nearest the wall. She crossed the garden without hurrying. 3 of the heritage rose bushes at the wall's base were showing damage from the frost that had come late in April. She could see it from 6 feet away, the way the new growth had blackened at the tips, the way 2 of the 3 canes had buckled at the bud union. The third plant was worse, its graft point exposed and weeping, the canes split along a line that was too high to simply cut back to sound wood. She crouched beside Marcus and looked at the 3 plants. "Diane saw them this morning," he said without preamble. She said to pull them and replace with the standard climber. Jonathan looked at the split cane on the third plant. She touched the wood just below the split with one finger, pressing gently to test for green beneath the bark, and found it. "This one's alive below the split," she said. 2 inches down, maybe 3. "I know," he said. She looked at the other two. The buckling at the bud union on the first was bad, but not final. The second had a sound cane beneath the damaged one. "All 3 are salvageable," she said, "if you cut now and get some soil support on the union." He said, "The instruction was to replace them." She held the branch of the third plant between her fingers and thought for a moment about Diane's instruction and about what these plants were. Portland roses propagated from cuttings, brought from France in damp cloth in the 1890s, which meant they were not replaceable with a standard climber regardless of what Diane believed. To replace them was to lose a direct material link in a chain of cultivation that was 4 generations long and would not, once broken, be recovered. She said, "I have my secateurs with me." He was quiet for a moment. "That would take most of the morning," he said. "I know," she said. He handed her his trowel without saying anything else, which was the agreement, and she began. She worked through the late morning by herself because Marcus was needed at the east end of the garden when the tour party arrived. She cut the damaged cane on the third rosebush 3 inches below the split, cutting at the correct angle, a clean line through sound wood, and packed the exposed graft union with soil mixed from the bag she found in the corner of the shed, Marcus indicated before he went. She pruned the second plant to its healthy cane and tied the remaining growth gently to the wall with the strips of soft garden tie she found hanging from a nail in the shed beside the door. The first plant was the most difficult. Its bud union was exposed on the south side, which meant the frost had found it without insulation, and she worked the soil around the base of the plant slowly and with more care than the other 2 required, because haste at a bud union was the specific error that finished a rose you had come to save. She packed the union with soil and firmed it gently with both hands through her gloves, and then sat back on her heels and looked at what she had done. The plants were not beautiful. They were reduced, cut back, their ties new and their wounds still visible, but they were going to come through. She was aware while she was working that she was not performing this for anyone. There was no one watching her, or if there was, she didn't know about it. Diane was somewhere in the north parterre with the morning's tour party. Marcus was at the east end. She was alone at the northwest corner with 3 rose bushes that had survived 4 generations of ownership and 1 April frost, and she was giving them the same careful attention she would have given them in her own garden or in any garden where someone asked her what she could do. She cleaned her secateur with the cloth she kept in her kit bag. She was sitting on the low stone ledge at the base of the wall, drinking the tea she had brought in a thermos, when Marcus came back around the northwest corner. He stopped when he saw the 3 plants and stood there for a long moment, looking at what she had done. She drank her tea. He came and sat on the ledge 2 feet from her and looked at the rose bushes, and then he said, "You didn't have to do that." "No," she agreed. "Diane's going to want to know why they haven't been replaced." "I imagine she'll want to know a few things," Jonathan said. He looked at her then. A look that had something in it she didn't try to name, and she looked back at him without trying to name it either. And neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched in a way that felt less like silence and more like a question that had been asked and not yet answered. Then he said, "What do you see when you look at this garden?" She considered the question seriously, the way it was asked seriously. "I see what 4 generations of choosing looks like," she said. Someone had to decide what was worth carrying forward, and then the next person had to decide the same thing, and the next. The garden is the record of what each of them decided mattered. He said, "Yes." That was all he said. The word had the weight of something confirmed. She poured the last of the tea into the lid of the thermos and set it on the stone between them, and he drank it without asking if that was what she was offering it for, because it was obvious it was. She did not pull him toward her. She did not lean. She was simply aware with a physical clarity she was not going to dramatize in her own head, that he was 2 feet from her on a stone ledge, in a garden that smelled of cut grass and wet soil, and the particular green sharpness of fresh pruned rose cane, and that this specific moment had a texture she would remember. The afternoon party arrived at 2:30, which was 40 minutes later than the scheduled time because Diane had extended the north parterre portion of the tour, which Jonathan learned from the woman with the clipboard, who told the volunteers with the harried efficiency of someone managing a schedule that had slipped its moorings. 14 guests this time, more than the afternoon before, several of whom Jonathan had not seen the previous day, which meant a second tier of invitations had been offered, which meant the event had grown. She positioned herself at the east border as she had the day before, and answered questions about the rambler roses trained along that section of wall, and gave accurate information, and did not under-explain because Diane found her explanations too technical. She was at the east border when Diane brought the afternoon party into the rose garden through the main gate, and she heard Diane begin the same account of the Portland Collection's provenance that she had given the day before, the same France, the same 1890s, the same damp cloth. She noticed, without particular feeling, that Diane's account did not include the 3 rose bushes at the northwest corner, the ones she had spent her morning saving. Marcus was standing at the north end of the garden near the old stone urn that marked the original garden's central axis, and he was watching the tour party, which meant he was also, from time to time, watching Jonathan, though she did not know this with certainty and was not going to assume it. Owen Rigby appeared at the garden gate at 3:10. He was a man of 65 or so, compact and deliberate, in the way of people who have spent most of their working lives outdoors and have been shaped by it into something specific and particular. He wore corduroy trousers and a waxed jacket, and he moved through the garden gate with the confidence of someone for whom the gate had never been closed. He was carrying a pair of long-handled loppers over one shoulder and had a second set of pruning shears on his belt, and his expression was that of a man who had come to do a job and had found a social event in his way and was prepared to be patient about it for a limited period. He came through the gate and crossed to where Marcus was standing near the stone urn. Jonathan was still at the east border, answering a question from a guest about the provenance of the Tuscany superb rose trained along the east wall, when she heard Owen say it. He said it clearly and without any consciousness that it carried weight, because to him it didn't carry weight. It was simply the man's name, and you addressed people by their names. He said, "Mr. Vale, I've had a look at the 3 Portland roses on the northwest wall. Whoever did that work this morning knew exactly what they were doing. All 3 will hold." 14 guests. Diane Vale with her mineral water and her grey clothing, and 4 generations of custodial certainty. The woman with the clipboard who had paused at the gate. Marcus standing by the stone urn saying nothing. The name moved through the garden the way a sound moves through water, not in a line but in all directions at once. Jonathan set down the spray of Tuscany Superb she had been indicating, and stood quite still. Diane's face went through those 3 expressions again, and the guests near her registered the change without knowing its content, and turned to look at the man by the stone urn. And the man by the stone urn stood there with the same expression he had worn all morning, which was not an expression of triumph or of revelation. It was simply the expression of a person who has been himself the entire time and has now been introduced to the room as himself. Diane said, "Marcus." He said, "Diane." She said, "You could have told me." He said, I did tell you. I told you the Portland roses were salvageable. There was a beat of silence that was also a correction, because the sentence he had just spoken was not exactly what had happened, which they both understood, and which meant the sentence was doing something else entirely. It was naming who had told her, and what she had done with it. Done. Diane looked at Jonathan. Jonathan looked back at her from the east border, which was where she had been positioned and where she remained. She had not moved toward the center of the garden. She had not moved toward Marcus. She was standing where she had been standing, and she let Diane look. Diane said, to the room rather than to Jonathan specifically, "I wasn't aware that the volunteer's background was in restoration work." A man near the gate said, mildly and without malice, "She just told us rather a lot about the Tuscany Superb, seemed to know it well." Someone else said, "Quite." These were small sentences and they were not unkind, but they had weight. They had the weight of a room that has understood something and is in the process of adjusting to it. The adjustment was not dramatic. No one raised a voice. No one performed a verdict. But the room had shifted. The way a room shifts when the foundation it had been built on turns out to have been different from what it appeared. Owen, who was still standing near the stone urn with his loppers over one shoulder and was not particularly interested in the social architecture of the moment, said to Marcus, "I'll start on the east border climbers if that's all right." And Marcus said that was fine. And Owen walked across the garden to the east border with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had 72 other tasks before nightfall and intended to reach them. He passed Jonathan on his way and nodded to her with the simple respect of one person acknowledging another person's work. And she nodded back. Petra arrived at 4 o'clock, which was the time Jonathan had told her she could pick her up from the estate gate, because the tour was scheduled to close at 4:30, and Jonathan had intended to be prompt about leaving, since being prompt about leaving was the courteous thing to do when you were a guest in someone else's space, regardless of whatever the last 2 days had been. She was at the estate gate, kit bag on her shoulder and gloves in her pocket, when Petra pulled up, and she opened the passenger door and got in. Petra looked at her. "You look," Petra said slowly, "like something happened." Jonathan looked out through the windscreen at the gravel drive and the pleached lime trees, which were lit in the late afternoon light in a way that made the interlocked branches look even more deliberate than they had that morning. 3 rose bushes, she said, 4 generations old. Did they survive? Yes, Jonathan said. Petra studied her for another moment with that look, the one that contained both affection and bewilderment, and then she started the car. They were at the curve in the drive, where it bent for the second time before the gates, when Jonathan saw Marcus in the rearview mirror, standing at the entrance to the formal parterre in his work clothes, watching the car. He had the pruning shears in his hand, the same ones he had been holding 2 days ago at the irrigation junction, and he was not signalling and not calling out. He was simply there, the way a person is there when they are not quite ready for something to end. Jonathan watched him in the mirror until the drive curved and took him out of sight. She said nothing. Petra said nothing. The lime trees moved past them on both sides, and the gravel shifted beneath the car's tires, and the estate gate opened in front of them as they approached, and they drove through it and back onto the road that had nothing to do with 4 generations of roses or stone walls, or the specific temperature of afternoon light, in a garden where someone had been watching you work. But 3 days later, a letter arrived. A proper letter, on paper, in an envelope addressed in handwriting she did not immediately recognize, but recognized after a moment, because she had seen it on the shed door's label, which said, "Only grounds," and was in the same handwriting, precise and unhurried. She opened the letter at her kitchen table in the particular quality of late spring morning light, which was warmer than February and made everything look less far away. It said that Owen Rigby reported the 3 Portland Roses were holding well. It said that the position of head volunteer consultant for the garden's conservation program was not yet a formal position, but that he was prepared to make it one, and that he would very much like her opinion of the East Border climbers, which he thought were being managed at the wrong seasonal intervals. It said, at the bottom, in a line that had more space above it than the rest of the letter, that the estate had belonged to his family for 4 generations, which she now knew, and that he had walked its grounds for most of his life, and that he had never seen anyone in the northwest corner who looked at the Portland Roses the way she did, as though they were something she had been trusted with, which they were. It was not a declaration. It was a letter from a person to another person, plain and specific, and it asked for a specific reply. Jonathan set it down on the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment. Then she went to the cupboard where she kept the good writing paper, the cream-coloured stock she had bought for an occasion that had not yet presented itself, and she took a sheet of it out and sat down with a pen. Through the kitchen window the garden was in full morning light, and her own roses, the climber she had been training up the back fence for 3 years, and the old damask in the corner bed were catching the sun at the particular angle that made the colour of them look exactly like what they were, something patient and specific that she had chosen to carry forward. She thought about what she would write. She thought it would not take her very long to find the words, because she had known for 2 days what she wanted to say, and she had simply been waiting for the question to be asked properly. She smoothed the cream paper with one hand and picked up the pen and began.